Welcome back to the AI Daily Brief. Boy, has this one been brewing all week, man. Today, we are finally digging into this report out of MIT claiming that 95% of generative AI pilots at companies are failing. Now, there is really important context and background on why this report is worth the time that we're about to give it. And simply put, that's because it has not stayed as just a point of discussion in the AI space or even in the corporate and enterprise space, but has actually been cited as one of the reasons that AI stocks are flailing right now. Analysts are talking about this, they're saying their clients want to talk about it, and it is being relentlessly cited as an example of why the AI bubble, in big ol' air quotes, is about to or in the process of popping. Now, this is not a market show, but I do think it's worth, before we dive into the report, having a little bit of a discussion about what I actually think is going on in the markets. As I'm recording this, Fed Chair Jerome Powell is about to speak in Jackson Hole. This is an annual central bankers conference where each year the Fed lays out their vision of what's to come. Now, this being Jerome Powell's last year, people aren't really looking at it as some big inflection point on what the future of the Fed might hold, but they are very closely looking at it when it comes to whether we're going to get a rate cut in September. Markets really want rate cuts in September, and they are very nervous that Jerome Powell is going to throw cold water on that in this speech. In that general nervous climate, which is also, by the way, being aided by the fact that we are in the late summer period where liquidity is low, and just in general, there's less actual stuff happening, there's definitely an increasing recognition of the fragility of the stock market and the extent to which it's been propped up by enthusiasm around AI. And this is absolutely undeniable. Ever since the rate hiking cycle started back in 2022, it has been AI enthusiasm versus the world. At every point when there's been some big crazy macro event, be it tariffs, be it war, AI enthusiasm has been there to hold it down and continue to give stock market investors something to be excited about and basically pin all their hopes onto. There is a growing fear now of what happens if that all goes away. That's being actively abetted by short sellers who are specifically going after stocks like Palantir, which they view as wildly overpriced. Add to that the reporting that Sam Altman agreed that we're in a bubble, which, by the way, his CFO was then deployed to walk back, plus wildly overstated reports around Meta not spending on AI, which they as well are denying. New chief AI officer at Meta, Alexander Wang, tweeted, "We are truly only investing more and more into Meta Superintelligence Labs as a company. Any reporting to the contrary of that is clearly mistaken." Ultimately, it doesn't matter. The point is that the market is jittery right now, and that is the context into which this MIT study has come. Now, I will say, as we get into this report, and into my very deep critique of both the report and the interpretation of the report, I will note that the folks at MIT who did this study are not working for Citron trying to tear down Palantir and other AI stocks. They didn't know the context that their study was going to be released into. They didn't know when they were typing this up that there was going to be a whole narrative moment around GPT-5. They didn't know that Sam Altman was going to say that we were in a bubble. The point is that while you can critique lots of things about this report, there was certainly no ill intent or an attempt to drive a particular narrative. It just happened to be the perfect headline bomb in that environment. Now, with those caveats out of the way, this is what I will say. Anyone, and I mean anyone, who is letting their opinion be overly shaped by this study, and especially anyone who is making financial decisions based on it, should be embarrassed and needs to rethink their general susceptibility to headlines. For two reasons. The first, the study just is not well constructed, period. I'm sorry, that's the truth. We're going to get into it. Second, it's not even really saying what the reporting has suggested. So let's get into this thing. The first weird thing about this is that it's been extremely hard to get your hands on the actual report. Everything about this, the entire conversation, came out of this one piece in Fortune called MIT Report. 95% of generative AI pilots at companies are failing. Now, we don't have nearly enough time to critique the general media discourse where people are comfortable just reading the headline and going with it as though it's fact. But the group at MIT who actually released this report did not make it easy to get their hands onto it. As recently as yesterday on Thursday, Professor Ethan Malik wrote, "Has anyone seen a copy of the Project Nanda report on 95% of AI pilots failing? It has been reported about widely, but I haven't been able to actually read it, though I filled out a form to get access. I want to understand what they found and how they measured it. Any links?" I had the same experience. As soon as I saw this news, I clicked the little link in the Fortune piece to the report and got this Google form to request access to the research. I did so numerous times, never heard from them, and eventually just found a version that someone had uploaded separately. Now, to the extent that it was an intentional decision not to make this report widely available, I kind of understand that after I got access to it. Before we get into the methodology, let's talk about the group behind this. It's called Project Nanda, and they describe themselves as, quote, building the foundational infrastructure for an internet of AI agents, i.e. the system where trillions of AI agents can collaborate, communicate, and transact across organizational boundaries. Created at MIT, Nanda provides the index, protocols, and tools needed to enable this decentralized protocol-neutral ecosystem. Now, where I think the issues begin with this report is in the methodology. In short, this thing is kind of like vibes masquerading as a credible academic study. Turns out that this report, which has been so widely cited as causing billions of dollars to come off of the market cap of AI stocks, is based around 52 interviews, 150 survey responses, and a review of public announcements to see if people had talked about how AI is making them money yet. For some context, Superintelligent interviews significantly more than 52 executives every day. The idea that you could get a broad-based understanding from that in a way that should move markets is extremely, extremely dubious. By the way, we don't have any information about who those executives were, the size of the organizations, the role the executives had within the organization, or any of that information which would help us contextualize and understand how much we're talking about big firms, small firms, mid-market firms. It's also worth questioning this so-called systematic review of over 300 publicly disclosed AI initiatives. Here's how the researchers say that they defined success. We define successfully implemented for task-specific Gen AI tools as one users or executives have remarked as causing a marked and sustained productivity and/or P&L impact. As Yoink AI's Brian put it on Twitter, the MIT report's main source is 300 plus companies' public announcements. The companies need to have announced that AI caused a marked and sustained productivity and/or P&L impact to be successful. No announcement apparently equals zero return? It really looks like they basically read press releases and SEC filings to determine if any of these things were successful based on how much productivity or P&L enhancement was being reported by the companies. Now, other problems start to reveal themselves when you dig in. When you go to section 3.4 of the report, they share that they found that 50% of Gen AI budgets are going to sales and marketing. Now, for them, this is part of why there's a Gen AI divide, because sales and marketing is a worse place to spend AI money than back office automation. But the idea for anyone who spent any amount of time digging around AI, that 50% of Gen AI budgets are going to sales and marketing is just absurd. Every credible study looking at where Gen AI is being applied sees it basically equal across the organization. It's everything from coding assistance to content generation to document and knowledge retrieval to product and design, sales productivity, customer engagement and service, QA and testing. In other words, there is no universe in which 50% of Gen AI spending is going to sales and marketing. The only implication of that can be that the people who they interviewed from these 52 organizations are hyper-concentrated in those domains, which is fine if we understand that, but when it's not revealed explicitly, it calls into question all of the implications of the broader study, reinforcing the idea that these were probably sales and marketing executives. When they asked their interviewees to allocate a hypothetical $100 to different functions, sales and marketing functions captured approximately 70% of the budget allocation. More broad than that, the terminology is very unclear in this. What they're referring to as a pilot is sort of ill-defined. What sort of implementations are happening that they're talking about is sort of ill-defined. There doesn't really seem to be any mention of AI or agentic coding, despite the fact that that is very clearly the breakout use case inside the enterprise. And it kind of feels like all of this is about deployments of Copilot tools and ChatGPT wrappers rather than agentic AI, which is obviously where all of the emphasis is right now in the enterprise. And agents are really important to this story because, and here's where we move out of the critique of the report itself into the critique of the way that it's being interpreted. When you actually take this thing at face value, the report is not actually about whether AI delivers value or not, but how much value accrues to individuals inside the corporation versus to the organization itself. The most unreported part of the study is that they found that basically all the value is accruing to the individual. They call this the shadow AI economy, and the starkest example they give is the percentage of companies who have purchased an LLM subscription versus employees who use LLMs regularly. Although they found that 40% of companies had purchased LLM subscriptions, they found 90% of employees were using LLMs regularly. In many cases, they write, shadow AI users reported using LLMs multiple times a day, every day of their weekly workload through personal tools, while their company's official AI initiatives remain stalled in pilot phase. Now, it's important to pause here, because the implication of all of these articles and all of the analysis on Wall Street about it was that what the study said was that 95% of AI is not useful and not valuable. In other words, it was not that 95% of pilots were structured in ways where the organization didn't get as much value as they wanted to. It was straight up that 95% of the time AI isn't useful. And that's just absolutely not what they're saying. And here's where some of our discourse about productivity is problematic. Let's imagine that everyone inside an organization starts using a full slate of AI tools and is instantly 40% more efficient. Basically, they do their work in 3 days instead of 5 days. Even if that happened and everyone across the organization had that same experience, that would not show up in productivity metrics or on a P&L. To show up in P&L or in some sort of productivity metric, the organization would either have to reduce the workforce by the equivalent 40% so that the overall cost to produce the same amount of outputs went down, or they'd have to ensure that each of those people who were now more productive went back and used that new time won back to produce more widgets for the same cost. Part of why organizations have been so aggressively interested in agents is that they have the potential to replace wholesale functions where that time can be better reorganized and reconstituted in a much more direct way than in the context of the very fuzzy person got their work done faster or better with ChatGPT type scenario. That's not to say that organizations aren't enthusiastic about their people using productivity-enhancing co-pilots. It's that when they think about the real big productivity gains of AI, they're looking beyond just the individual deployment of tools to the redesign of systems, and especially the redesign of systems where agents are taking on big chunks of the work. Now, here's the other big problem with the interpretation of this report. Even if the numbers were correct and 95% of Gen AI pilots were failing, the way that the market and the naysayers have been interpreting this is that that means that 95% of AI technology itself is crap, rather than the much more obvious, if you've ever worked inside an organization or big enterprise, even for a little bit at any point in your life interpretation, which is that there are major problems not with the technology, but with the implementation of the technology. Problems, in other words, on the organization side. Well, it turns out that even right there in the report, it is very clear that much of the problem is on the organizational side. When users were asked to rate each issue on a scale of 1 to 10 on how big a barrier it was in scaling AI in the enterprise, there were technical problems. Model output quality concerns got a 7.5, and poor user experience got around a 7. But the other 3 top answers all had to do with the organization itself. Challenging change management got a 6.5, lack of executive sponsorship got a 6.5, and an unwillingness to adopt new tools got a full 9. Yet given that we at Superintelligent do this day in and day out, and actually interview thousands of people about these questions, I've put together this list of 15 reasons why AI pilots actually fail. And let's be clear, some of them are, yes, technology problems. There can be platform mismatches, where a startup is trying to implement a new solution that just doesn't play well with whatever legacy systems an enterprise has. This is a really common refrain. Now, usually you can avoid that before you get into the pilot if you've gone through any sort of quality assessment and design process to actually lay out the approach, but still it's there. There is also, yes, underperformance. This is a new technology. Startups are going to overpromise and underdeliver sometimes. It would be insane to claim that they didn't. We also are dealing with an environment where there can very easily be surprise costs, where a thing that you thought was going to take X tokens actually takes X times 10 tokens, and there's overages, and all of a sudden people are all chagrined, and the thing that seemed like it was going to add value actually isn't all that much cheaper in the first place. There are other technology problems as well, and the point is that I'm not trying to obfuscate those things or say that they don't exist. My point is that whether you consider this 1 or 3 or 5 of the problems, I'm about to tell you about 15 others that are on the organizational side. And let's start with the most obvious one, which is leadership buy-in. If executives are not bought into change, it will not happen. Anytime we see an organization where there's some innovation group that has a theoretical mandate to do AI pilots, but not actually the budget to do so or the executive sponsorship to do so, we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that it's got an extremely limited shelf life. It's just not going to go that far. Leadership buy-in is the fundamental prerequisite to all change, period, not just AI change. We see constantly the organizations that have the best agent readiness scores when we do our assessments are those that have not only executive buy-in, but CEO level buy-in. Without it, you're just living on borrowed time. Interestingly, though, there is an inverse of this, which is equally important, frankly, which is team buy-in. We often see the opposite situation, which is where the executives are thrilled, engaged, highly excited and motivated, but haven't taken the time to get their teams and employees bought in. Now, those teams and employees may be going through a set of considerations and concerns around what these technologies are going to mean for them. Are they simply training their replacements? What's the company's visions of how digital employees and human employees are going to interact in the future? Is this an organization that's trying to use agents to do new things, build new products that weren't possible before? Or is it an organization that's just trying to cut costs at any cost? Lots and lots of studies have shown this potential for misalignment between employees and executives. A number of times I've shared this study from Writer last December that interviewed 800 employees and 800 executives and found just wildly divergent perspectives on AI inside the organization. For example, this 31% gap between executives and employees when it comes to belief that their company has a high level of AI literacy, a 30% gap between the percentage of employees who think the company had been successful in adopting AI versus the number of executives who did, and so on and so forth. So yes, you need leadership buy-in, but you need team buy-in just as much. Next up, we have problem value fit. This is basically where you see a really cool demo and you decide to try it out, but no one can really name the metric that's going to move. These tend to come out of briefs that talk about innovation or productivity in the abstract, but where the people who are actually implementing this can't point to a specific error or cost or problem that's going to actually be impacted positively. Success then tends to feature anecdotes and screenshots, not a target KPI or baseline. And speaking of baselines, this is another area where pilots often fail. Teams will say it feels faster or it feels better, but no baseline exists and there's no control. The dashboards that we create don't have a before number. Wins in these situations are measured in vibes. And when challenged, teams can't show lift or even really a simple pre and post. Another challenge is that a lot of times, the tools and systems that are being implemented lack the relevant enterprise context to actually be useful. Sometimes, yes, just a general purpose tool can provide some lift, but a lot of times, what's going to make AI work or not is the information and data it has access to regarding the enterprise that it's trying to work within. Enterprise AI that lacks enterprise context is ultimately extremely limited, which gets to another problem, of course, which is data readiness. Lots of times that context does exist, but not in ways that AI can take advantage of. There's a reason that you see so much effort and work around things like getting enterprise data into MCP servers, or you see tons of money being spent on the AIification of data lakehouses. It's because of that context question and the need that AI has to have all that enterprise context that's obviously expressed in the form of data, ready and able to be used by these AI systems. Unfortunately, though, when it comes to enterprise data, it's not just a readiness issue, it's also an access issue. I was talking with a hedge fund earlier this year, and they were in the midst of getting all of their data and signal into formats that were accessible by AI systems. The problem was that across the organization, there was a huge variety of different levels and types of data permissions. One person might have access to data sets X, Y, and Z, but not A, B, and C, while another person might have access to A, Y, and D, but not B, Q, and F, and so on and so forth. So even once you've got your data in a format that is usable by AI, you then have to design systems for permissions and provisioning that reflect the real world of who can interact with what information. At this point, if your head is spinning around how much has to go into making these systems work, you're not alone, man. Another big challenge is poorly documented workflows. Now, as I talk about all the time on this show, AI is not RPA 2.0. Organizations that think about it simply as a way to one-to-one automate the existing work that people do are wildly under-maximizing the potential of what AI can do for their organizations. At the same time, a lot of the natural starting points are some amount of automation of existing monotonous workflows, which can only happen if those workflows are actually documented in a way that the AI can understand. There's a reason that you see 1 million startups right now that are basically recording the screens of people who are doing work to understand exactly what they do so that they can then go imitate and hopefully improve upon those workflows. But right now, on average, the quote-unquote documentation of workflows exists solely in the heads of the employees who are actually doing that work. And then, of course, there's skills enablement and support. Wait, so you're giving all of your employees access to this incredibly powerful and complex new technology? And you think that just because the technology itself is expensive, you shouldn't also have to pay for skills enablement and upskilling? Sorry, man, it's not how it works. Even people who are quote unquote AI experts are only AI experts because of the sheer amount of time they've spent figuring out how to actually interact with these systems. In many cases, the patterns that we have from using and interacting with previous software do not apply to Gen AI. And guess what? The state-of-the-art opportunities that AI really represents are going to take way more than a Coursera prompt engineering course. Now, this is also a market provisioning problem, given that there are so few good resources for things like how to interact with and manage agents. But part of the reason that it's a market problem is that entrepreneurs know that enterprises are trying to get out of this without having to pay for that, and so they don't want to be the one who's desperately clinging to the coattails asking for some scraps for the table. If organizations and enterprises are serious about AI transformation up and down the organization, both in terms of agents doing big buckets of new work, but also their existing employees being more productive, they're going to have to pony up for skills training, enablement, and broader change management. Then, of course, you have some very obvious things like overzealous risk departments that don't allow people to actually use these tools in the ways that could create the most opportunity. For example, we have a partner right now that is reselling our voice agent interview assessments to their clients, but whose risk department will not let their teams be interviewed by voice agents. If you want to try to take the time to go make sense of that, by all means, I'm just going to keep cashing the checks. There are broader management issues like organizational fragmentation, where different people in different parts of the organization may be piloting different systems that don't necessarily work with one another or even in competition. Or the reverse, which is existing vendor lock-in. And I think this one is worth taking a moment for in the context of this specific study. It's pretty clear if you read between the lines of this thing that the employees at these organizations that this MIT group looked at are fundamentally disinterested in using the crappy versions of tools that their organizations are giving them access to, and instead just want to use the general consumer tools that are way more advanced. Call this the Copilot ChatGPT problem. Anyone who has touched AI at all in the enterprise has seen examples of this, where when you're logging in with your Gmail at home and using these most advanced reasoning models, to then have to come back and use the neutered versions that your enterprise is giving you access to is just completely unbearable. Especially because in a lot of cases, every new update of the state-of-the-art unlocks meaningful amounts of new use cases. It's not like we're so far into the future right now where even older, crappier models are super useful. For some use cases they are, but for many use cases, you really need something that's close to the state-of-the-art, and if you don't have access to it, you're simply not going to be able to do that work. The way that the MIT group puts it is this: employees know what good AI feels like, making them less tolerant of static enterprise tools. The last couple reasons I'll mention that pilots fail have to do with leadership again, but leadership in the context of the pilots. It can so often happen that pilot ownership or leadership is like a hot potato. Some executive sponsor says that they want it, they hand it off to someone who has never exactly bought in, and then they're just going through the motions of aiding the pilot when they're not even particularly convinced that it's actually going to be all that useful. This happens all the time. And it's why I separated leadership buy-in and team buy-in and said that they're both incredibly important in context with one another. And then, of course, there's this situation. In the circumstance where even if ownership of the pilot is clear, it's a one-off with no strategic plan or next steps articulated and no ultimate direction. At this stage, this is the default and the norm. Let's try a pilot to see what we can do without any larger consideration of the big goals that you're trying to achieve as an organization. Pilots that are conducted like this in a strategic vacuum are simply much less likely to succeed and be a part of actual organizational change. I've been discussing this study throughout the week with our head of research, and when I asked her to estimate the actual distribution of failure rates between organizational issues and technology, her thesis was that it was about 80% organizational, 20% technology. So 4-to-1 organizational versus tech-related issues. Now, there's one more funny thing underneath all of this, which is the idea of using pilot failure as a bully cudgel in the first place. Like the idea that pilots failing isn't simply a part of the expected distribution of pilot results. If you are running an organization and trying a novel technology like AI, especially one that's as fast-moving and dynamic as AI, and all of your pilots are working, it is almost assuredly the case that you're not being experimental enough. You're not trying enough things. You're not thinking far enough about what AI could be doing for you. Some percentage, in other words, of your pilots should be failing. Certainly not the 95% that MIT claims, but some meaningful amount. AI, again, is not a technology that's exclusively meant to be a one-to-one replacement for existing workflows. It represents an opportunity to do things that were not possible before, and you're not going to discover those things if you have no tolerance for pilot failure. Now, luckily, a week under our belt, we're finally having a narrative shift again around the report. VentureBeat writes, MIT report misunderstood. Shadow AI economy booms while headlines cry failure. Fortune's AI editor felt the need to go write a follow-up. An MIT report that 95% of AI pilots fail spooked investors. But it's the reason why those pilots fail that should make the C-suite anxious. Like I said at the beginning, I think a lot of the resonance of this report has to do with larger market forces right now. And in a different context, we wouldn't be giving it all this attention that we've been giving it. However, to the extent that it becomes used as an excuse for why your organization can slow walk this change, I think that you're doing yourself a disservice. Hopefully you have a better sense now of not only why you should perhaps take this particular set of results with a grain of salt, but also a better roadmap of the type of reasons that pilots actually fail in practice. In any case, this has gone on way too long. It's a Friday. Go out, have a great weekend. I'm sure we'll have more to talk about next week. Appreciate you listening or watching as always. And until next time, peace.